Super excited to have George here today. I don't know how many of you know George, but it is just such an honor. I respect George's work so much, and we'll give just a brief introduction of the background that I know about him, and then our experiences working together. But George got his BA in economics and environmental science, and then a master's degree in forest science at Yale, and then a PhD in aquatic and fishery sciences from University of Washington, and has worked on a whole bunch of different related stuff with the NOAA program. But the thing that I think you're probably most famous for, perhaps to your blessing or curse, I don't know, is really leading the science program at the Elwha Dam removals. And it has been a place where we have learned so much about everything from the costs of dam removal to the ecology to the engineering. It has just been such a well from which to draw in terms of learning. And none of that really would have happened without George's leadership and foresight and persistence over many years. It is just, it is such a resource for all the rest of us. And to see the great sciences come out of it has been really impressive. And also the ability to, George, that you have to connect across parts, right? Rather than just being this one person who focuses solely on fish, for example, you have had this synergistic effect on the science of dam removal that's been pretty profound. So really excited, obviously, to have you here, and appreciate your time and talking with us about the Elwha. As I've mentioned, I think to you, George, we're working on, for this class, working on the Klamath Dam removals, trying to understand the effects of the sediment pulse downstream on the Sea Shasta disease dynamics. But I'm also working on a grant related to studying both the anthropology and the sort of engineering and ecology sides of the Klamath Dam removals. So there's probably going to be some questions about what we can learn from the Elwha on the Klamath from the students, but also just a deep interest in this theme from all the students. So thank you so much. I really appreciate your time. And with that, you should have sharing capacity. So I will turn it over to you.
Okay, thank you very much. And it's a real honor to give a presentation at Desiree's class. I have the same mutual respect that she does for me. She's done wonderful things, and really appreciate this time with you all. And I'm looking forward to the Q&A part. So I'm going to share my screen now. Let's see how this works. Hopefully it works well. I'm going to share this one. And I just need to know when I share my screen, can you guys see it in terms of slideshow mode? Let me know. Not yet?
No, we see like all the slides in.
Okay.
Or not.
How about now?
Yep. There you go.
Okay. So, and I assume Desiree that we're going to have Q&A after I'm done.
How would you like to do it, George?
Well, I guess I'll defer to you. What have you found to be the best way of doing it? Like questions during the talk, or do you think after?
I think it can go either way. Maybe if we could do it as a webinar style. So if folks want to put their questions in the chat window, I can keep track of those. And then also if folks want to have just unmute themselves and ask questions at the end, we can do that. So let's wait till the end.
Okay, and then yeah, putting them in the window so we don't forget is a great idea, and we'll go there. So again, everyone, thanks for allowing me to give this talk today. And I don't list names when I give the Elwha talk. I just show you all the different entities that are involved, because of all the individuals, it would take up multiple pages. And again, the title of the talk is Ecosystem Response to the Removal of the Elwha River Dams, and I will try to give a true definition for that. So for today's talk, just a quick question. Can you guys see the slides moving now? I just moved to the second slide. Is it working okay?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. So I'm going to go quickly over kind of a context for dam removal and what is ecosystem response, and then talk a little bit about what the Elwha looked like prior to the dam removals, and then mention the Elwha River Ecosystem and Fisheries Restoration Act, and then just show you some ooh-ah pictures of the dam removal itself. And then I'll focus a little bit on the how the sediment supply changed, where did the sediment go, and how did the habitats change. And then I'll kind of shift gears and focus on the salmon for a little while and how they have responded to the dam removal, as well as what kind of impacts there were from the initial sedimentation. And then I'll focus on a variety of different ecosystem changes that have occurred to date. So dam removal, as you probably know, since you're in Desiree's class, has really increased over the last several decades in terms of the number of dam removals per year that we're seeing, or per decade even. The map on the far upper right shows you where most of those dam removals have occurred. And most of these dam removals have been smaller dams, basically less than 10 meters in height. And part of the reason for that is most of them have been somewhere in the Midwest or the Northeast. Now, when we kind of take a step back and we look at the West Coast, we obviously have larger mountains and we obviously have larger dams. And this just gives you a brief understanding of where some of the dams have been removed. And then obviously, you know about the Klamath. And I'm going to focus in the upper right here on the Olympic Peninsula on the Elwha Dam. So the Elwha River is located on Washington State's Olympic Peninsula. The majority of it, if you look in the upper right-hand corner here, is in Olympic National Park in the green, over 85% of it. And it drains north into the Strait of Juan de Fuca. It has a drainage area of over 800 square kilometers, and it's a pretty typical watershed for the Olympic Peninsula. It has multiple tributaries. It goes from approximately 1,500 meters in height in terms of the upper end down to sea level. And we have dry, warm summers and cool, wet winters, a combination of in terms of the geology, and then your kind of typical Western Washington vegetation in terms of trees. One thing I want to note about the Elwha that'll come into play is that it's a series of canyons and broad floodplains. So on the map here, the dark gray is the valley bottoms, the floodplain areas, and then the white is where the canyons are, and that'll come into play in terms of what we see with the fish later. So the Elwha has pretty much all the salmon species that we typically have in a northwest watershed. It also has non-salmonids such as eulachon or candlefish and Pacific lamprey in the bottom right-hand side here. And very typical of most watersheds, historically, we had hundreds of thousands of fish returning. You can see on the graph on the left here. And today we have maybe, 5 to 10% of what historically occurred. One thing people don't think about is this change in species composition. So historically, pink salmon actually dominated in terms of numbers of fish. And what we see today are Chinook salmon, followed by coho and steelhead. But the bottom line is all the native populations, like most of our watersheds, are in very low abundance. So the Elwha dams were built in the early 1900s, and they cut off over 90% of the accessible habitat. The first dam was Elwha Dam at River Kilometer 8, followed by Glines Canyon Dam at River Kilometer 22, I believe, and those were built in the early 1900s. And in 1992, the Elwha River Ecosystem and Fisheries Restoration Act was passed for the removal of these dams and full restoration of the Elwha River ecosystem and its native anadromous fisheries. And for those that don't know, anadromous fisheries are salmon, basically those that spawn in the freshwater, rear, go out to saltwater, and come back as adults to spawn. And these are two Chinook salmon that you're staring at right here. So one of the big issues was what was going to happen to all the sediment. So the two dams were in place for over 100 years, and basically there was over 21 million cubic meters of sediment behind the reservoirs. Most of that being finer materials, sand or less, but a significant portion being coarse. And what was predicted based on both the empirical and computational models as well as the physical models was that about half to a little over half could erode downstream with the dam removal. The picture on the right is simply showing you what one of the reservoirs looked like. That's former Mills Reservoir, the upper one, which had the majority of the sediment. And there was a lot of predictions, very high, and the predictions were pretty extreme, very high suspended sediment levels, a temporary deposition of the finer material, particularly in the slower water areas such as pools, a more dynamic connection to the floodplain, the bed actually building up in the lower river, and then actually the creation of an estuary. So the dam removal actually started in September 2011, and this is literally, this picture was taken the day before dam removal started. And this is the Elwha Dam located at river kilometer 8, and it had a little less than 5 million cubic meters of sediment, most of that being silt and clay. And the way they took this dam out was they basically created a cofferdam upstream, and they shunted the river to one side of the valley and then deconstructed on the other side. So you can see here, they shunted it to one side, taking out what was part of the dam on the other side. And then they moved the river back from the upstream portion, and then they deconstructed on the other side. And this started, like I said, in September of 2011. And by April of 2012, it was done. And this is what it looked like in August of 2012. So the lower dam didn't take that long to take out. It was about 100 feet in height, I think. Now, the upper dam, which is located at river kilometer 22, was simultaneously taken out, but this one was a little bit more complex. This was over 200 feet in height and had the vast majority of sediment behind it, over 15 million cubic meters, and most of that was actually sand and gravel. So that's the one that was going to really change the river more so than anything. So the way they did that is they basically put in a floating barge with a 2,000-pound jackhammer at the top, and got a lot of OSHA permits, and they basically floated the barge back and forth across the face of the dam, taking the dam down a couple feet a day. Now, they did this also to basically regulate the sediment that was coming out of the dam, and this is the way they were able to kind of control that. Eventually, there was no more reservoir to float a barge, so they had to helicopter in heavy equipment that would take out the remainders of the dam. And then eventually they got down to the lowest portion, and then eventually, after several years, actually, they actually got to finishing it. So while the lower dam didn't take much time, the upper dam took several years to complete. And that eventually allowed access to the entire river basin for anadromous fish. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about what has occurred since the removal with the dam. And I'm going to talk about it two ways. One is by location, so talk about the dams and the former reservoirs, a little bit about the near shore, but really focusing on the river ecosystem. And then I'm going to talk about it by physical and biological processes, specifically how the sediment dynamics and the fish recolonization both affected the river food web, the terrestrial linkages. And I'm not going to spend any time today on revegetation, just for the sake of time, but I just, if people do have questions, I could talk about that as well. So the main question with this dam removal is, how did the sediment supply change? So what we have here on the x-axis is time by year, going from June of 2011 to June of 2017. And on the y-axis, we have a indirect or a metric of sediment supply turbidity. And the light blue is one measure of turbidity, and the orange is another, but pretty similar to each of them. So dam removal started in September of 2011, and you can see that we see a spike in turbidity levels. And then the Elwha Dam was removed in April of 2012, and you can see a small spike there again. But it really wasn't until Mills Reservoir, which is the upper reservoir, was fully exposed to erosion. And what I mean by that, there was no more reservoir left. It was just run of the river. That's when we started to see turbidity levels really increase and stay up over time. And it wasn't until actually Glines Canyon Dam was removed that we saw more of a periodicity to the sediment supply. In other words, you could see through this whole time period, just sediment supply was high up until about October of 2014. We actually had some issues with rockfall that resulted in fish passage issues. So there was some blasting that occurred in 2015. But then you could see things died down, and they have stayed down. So basically, concentrations peaked after Mills Reservoir was exposed to erosion, but have decreased down to background levels since 2016. So how much sediment was released? That is the question. And excuse me for a minute. I apologize. I thought this phone was off. Hold on. Just one moment. My sincerest apologies. Anyway, so how much sediment was released during that time period? So what the estimate was that somewhere between 40 and 60% of the total stored sediment was estimated to be released during and post dam removal. And most of that stored sediment, as you can see, was in former Mills Reservoir. And then you could see how much was actually released. So overall, about 60% of the total stored sediment was actually released to the river as of October 2015. And you can see the photo on the right, what I mean by the sediment. So on the left of that photo, you can see where there's still reservoir. But once the river basically had access to its entire reservoir, that's when the sediment, and particularly the bedload material, really started to show. So I'm just going to give you an example of what actually changed. You can see a tributary coming in here where the red circle is. That's Boulder Creek coming in. And if we were down at Boulder Creek in September of 2011, you can see the flow going away from you here. This is what it looked like at the start of dam removal. And then by 2019, you could see where, with the red arrow, where the surface of Boulder Creek used to be. So we had some pretty significant down cutting in the reservoir itself, which makes total sense as the sediment is released downstream. But really, one of the more dramatic places where sediment ended up was the estuary. So this is just some LiDAR starting in the upper left from August 2011. And then if you go to the bottom right, that's what it looked like in February of 2016. So you can see in a matter of basically a little less than 5 years, we actually developed an estuary with a barrier beach and blind tidal channels in the estuary. So if we look at an aerial photo, what does that look like? It looks like this. So you could walk out a half a kilometer more from where you historically could, and then over a kilometer and to a kilometer and a half, basically due east. So that entire, basically, that estuary built over a short time period of 5 years. So the main question that I'm going to focus on now in terms of habitat is, how did the freshwater habitat downstream of the dams in the river itself increase or change with the increase in sediment supply? So what we have here is just another metric of riverbed elevation change on the y-axis and time on the x. And I'll just point out 3 places. One is where dam removal begins. You can start seeing we're getting much more fluctuation in terms of riverbed elevation change. Once Elwha Dam was removed, we see a slight increase in riverbed elevation downstream of that point, but it really wasn't again until Mills Reservoir was fully exposed to the river itself that we started to see bed material move downstream and erode the river by almost 1.5 meters, and up to 2 meters in some places. And the middle Elwha between the 2 dams, so what you're looking at here is the former glines at the upstream end, and then water's kind of rushing towards you. The red lines denote floodplain channels. So I'm going to just show you some examples of change. One was gravel bar development and wood accumulation in the actual main river itself. Another one is the change in the longitudinal profile, what that looked like with the accumulation of sediment, particularly in the pools. And then I'm just going to give you a very obvious visual example of what happened when we actually started getting channel forming flows to affect river condition. And that happened after, actually. We didn't get many big flow events until about 4 years after the dam removal, the lower dam removal. So gravel bar development was pretty obvious. If you flew over this one section of river and the flows going from the bottom to the top here, this is what it looked like in 2011, right before dam removal on the left. And on the right-hand side, what it looked like during dam removal, you could see the development of large gravel bars. If you look closely, you could start seeing wood accumulating that was coming from the reservoir area. And then if you were standing by one of the roads and looking upstream, this is what it looked like in October of 2012, and not even a year later, you could see these massive gravel bars develop with a lot of wood on them. And that's all basically from the dam removal. So very obvious, distinct changes there. In terms of the longitudinal profile, we're going from basically the upper right here, from where former Glines Canyon Dam was, down to where former Aldwell Reservoir was. And I'm showing you 2 things here. One is the green shows you pre-dam removal where the stream bed was. And you can see we had these really significantly large pools. The black shows you where the river was in November of 2012. So all these pools filled in essentially during that time period. So the way the river basically aggraded was it built up the sediment in the main stem channel as well as the floodplain channels, not necessarily on the floodplain surface initially, but in the actual channel itself. That's where most of the material actually ended up. However, once the material ended up there, it eventually started to change how erosion happened. So in other words, it wasn't until basically the bed got finer and the sediment built up that we started to see bank erosion events and avulsions happen in the river. So these black areas here denote areas that were basically taken out with one flow here. And this is what it looked like in August 2011. And all these areas after a November 15 flood event actually were taken out. So bank erosion and avulsion, which is a different obvious process than just aggradation, occurred after the aggradation occurred, which is something that none of us really predicted per se. So in summary, what we've seen was all the pools were filled and now they've unfilled quite a bit. We saw the development of mid-channel gravel bars and a lot of wood accumulation, and that's still there, although some of those mid-channel gravel bars are now becoming forested. We saw the channels, the floodplain channels fill and then stabilize, and then the sediment accumulate on the floodplain. At the same time, when we started getting big flow events, that's when bank erosion started to occur, and the channel started to move laterally as opposed to vertically at that time. So in summary, over about 20 million cubic meters of sediment was released. About 11% of it was stored in the actual river itself. So the main stem and then the floodplain channels of the main stem. But the vast majority of the sediment went out into the Strait of Juan de Fuca. And the upper right-hand corner photo there is, if we were in a boat together during that time, we could kind of go through that big plume of sediment, and it's just basically it's suspended sediment. But eventually, as the sediment changed, it started to deposit in the nearshore. So most of it came out, transported into the strait, but then almost a third of it basically ended up to create the estuary that we see today. So now I'm going to change my focus and talk a little bit about salmon. And before we start talking about the Elwha itself, I want to give you just a primer about salmon. And that is, salmon are real opportunists. They can colonize newly available habitats in a matter of years to decades. So on the x-axis here, we have the number of years since an area was opened up or created or opened up due to a dam removal or naturally due to deglaciation, or a ladder was put in. And what you see here is that in a matter of years to decades, you can get a 1 to 4-fold increase in population abundance, irrespective of the size of the initial population, which is the number associated with each of these river systems. And the Elwha is no different. So for example, we started out with about 300 winter steelhead. We're now about 1,500 winter steelhead. So the point being here is salmon are very opportunistic creatures. They're very adaptable to new habitats, and that's what makes them, something that are prevalent across the Pacific Rim. So one of the challenges that we had was, how do we actually measure returning adult salmon as well as juvenile salmon? And the joke that I like to make, although it's not as good when you're not in a live audience where people can laugh, but that's okay, is that salmon are exactly like measuring trees, except you can't see them and they're constantly moving. So they're a very challenging group of animals to actually measure in terms of their population size. And they come in at different times. So you can see here, spring, summer, fall, winter, they're coming in all the different times by the different different species, and we have different ways of measuring them. And two of the ways that one of the ways we historically measure them is we do something called a spawner survey, where we walk a river and we count their spawning nests. But the river was so turbid during the time of dam removal, we asked the question, well, what could we use that would allow us to see through the turbidity and give us a number? And we came to the conclusion that sonar was the way to go. And so this is a sonar unit on the left. It basically it throws out sound waves, and fish can cross through this area, and we can actually theoretically then enumerate how many fish are going upstream. We also used spawner surveys or RED surveys. Spawning nest is called a RED, R-E-D-D. Anyway, to look at the distribution of fish as well. So that method was still used, but for something slightly different than enumeration. So we had two sonars located at the lowermost part of the river. The water is flowing towards you here. Here's the mouth of the Elwha, and as you go up. And the reason that we had it that low down, because we wanted to enumerate the whole population, and we did this for Chinook salmon and for steelhead. And so we basically hung an $80,000 piece of equipment off a Home Depot ladder, and then hooked it up to a solar panel behind this log jam here. And what you're seeing in the photo too are essentially wickets out there to kind of push the fish away from the sonar so we could get better resolution. And if anybody's interested in this technology, we could talk about it in length some other time. It's a really cool technology that has worked very well for us. So this gives you an idea how many more fish are we seeing or how things have changed. So the green dots show you the number of Chinook salmon that returned since 1990. So on average, a couple thousand Chinook salmon returned to the Elwha, and most of these fish are hatchery fish, and that's something that we'll talk a little bit more about. The Elwha Dam was removed in 2012. Glines Canyon Dam was removed in 2015, and you can see we've seen an increase from about 2,000 to a max of about 7,600 fish. The red dots are steelhead. We didn't have as many pre-data points for steelhead, but we've seen a similar trend where we've seen an increase over time. We also have less of a hatchery contribution with those fish. So we've seen a positive increase in the number of adults, but I'm not going to tell you that this is due to the dam removal at this point in time. It's really too early to tell. I do think that having access to more area has helped the fish and maybe part of the reason why we're seeing more fish at this point. For juveniles, we asked the same question: how can we actually enumerate the number of out-migrating smolts from the river system, as well as what kind of standing crop of fish are in the river at various seasons? So we've used 3 techniques here where we use screw traps at the mouths of tributaries or at the lower part of the main stem river, electroshocking and snorkel surveys. And I'm going to just focus a little bit on the screw traps because that gives us an idea of how many out-migrating smolts there are. And we had a screw trap on the main stem since 2005. And then on the tributaries, we've had a screw trap in the Little River and Indian Creek, both of which were above the first dam, but below the second dam. And both of which had no impact from sediment, which is going to be an important point when we start talking about fish later. So keep that in mind. So what we saw as an example is that we actually saw quite a bit of sediment impact to the juvenile outmigrating fish, which makes sense. So you can see here, prior to dam removal, between 2007 and 2012, it was somewhere between 50 to 150, 200,000 outmigrating Chinook salmon. Kind of the same number during dam removal up to 2015, and then we didn't see a change until 2019. And the number that we have for 2020 is basically an average of over 1 million outmigrating Chinook salmon. So it hasn't been until about 2019 that we've actually started to see the benefits of the dam removal because we had sediment impacts, which totally makes sense if you think about it. And when we look at some other species, what we find is that the Chinook salmon are doing better post-dam removal. Some other salmon are not doing as well, still pink salmon and chum. I'm not showing you steelhead, but steelhead have increased as well. So, and coho have dramatically increased as well. So some species have benefited more than others up to this point, and there's a variety of reasons for that, including initial population size. So in terms of salmon recolonization above the dams themselves, how did that actually happen? Well, a couple ways. One was there was assisted relocation, particularly during dam removal when the sediment loads were high. Hatchery and wild adult coho salmon were actually caught in the river or they were coming back to the hatchery, and we actually moved them into the Clearwater tributaries that I was telling you about. And we did that in part with a wild steelhead as well. That's what the co-managers of the resource, the tribe and the state of Washington wanted to do. However, there was natural colonization of both of these species along with a number of other species. So at the end of the day, the recolonization was basically a combination of relocation and natural recolonization by adult salmon. There were no juvenile outplants. It was just adults being moved to certain locations. We did have problems associated with the dam removal. A rock fall occurred in 2014. You can see on the picture on the left that that's about a 25-foot barrier there that really caused some significant problems for fish passage. Eventually, by October of 2015, we went in there and blew those boulders up, and these boulders are the size of, basically, they're bigger than Volkswagens. They're pretty big. And that allowed for fish passage since 2015 to the upper river, which is the majority of the river system. So when we look at the distribution of where these animals are now, we could see that if you look here, there's a map of the Elwha going from the headwaters on the bottom part to the top. Bull trout, steelhead, and Chinook salmon have made it all the way to the upper watershed. Coho, sockeye, chum, and pinks have made it to the lower part of the middle watershed. So we haven't seen that many of those species up into this upper portion yet. So now I want to talk a little bit about salmon life history, because it's really important, because when we think of dam removal, we think of what we typically think of as more fish. And we don't think of one of the more important things, and that's life history diversity. So what I mean by life history diversity is that for these animals, they can do a number of different things and end up at the same place in terms of when they spawn. But so for example, Chinook salmon, which is the fish on the left here, they all kind of swim upstream once the dam removal happened. But as juveniles, some of them can stay in the fresh water for a shorter period of time, some in a longer period of time. And that life history diversity is really critical to the resilience of the population in case one thing happens. So everybody, when they think of dam removal, they think of what I just showed you there. What they don't think, though, about is what happens to the fish that were above the dam, like bull trout. Well, those fish actually can now go downstream if they want, and bull trout do that, and go into the marine environments, which would be really beneficial from a nutrient perspective and a food resource perspective. The other thing that we don't think about is with steelhead, for example, in Puget Sound, we have two kinds of steelhead. We have winter steelhead that return during the winter, and then we have summer steelhead that return the late summer, early fall. And historically in the Elwha, we always heard about that there was a summer steelhead run, but we never really saw it, maybe for a couple fish. So typically what you would have is adult winter fish returning and going to the upriver areas. But we also had a lot of resident rainbow above the dams. And resident rainbow are the same species as steelhead, except they are a resident form. They're smaller. So we actually have now offspring of these fish migrating out. And guess what? We are getting fish now returning as something called summer steelhead. In other words, we have fish that are returning to the upper watershed not only during the winter, but during the summer. And that we call the reawakening of a life history strategy. So then the question becomes, well, why does that happen? Where does that come from? So if we look at the evidence for that, we see that there's been an increase in the number of summer steelhead. And this is actually, this photo by John McMillan is the first documented summer steelhead above the dams since the dams were created. This was in October of 2013, so not even any data here. But you can see we saw a dramatic increase in the number of summer steelhead going from just tens to over 300 in 4 years. And most of these fish, if you look at the map on the right, are located in this upper watershed above both of the dams. So you can see where the dams are at River Kilometer 8 and 22. And most of these summer steelhead are up here. Most of the winter steelhead are lower down. So then the question becomes, well, what is there any other reason for this besides the fact that the river opened up? Is there a genetic basis for this that can actually affect the run timing of these fish? And what patterns in terms of the genetics, what do they tell us about recolonizing salmon or steelhead in this watershed? And where I'm going with this is that there's something called a GREB1L marker. And what that basically is a gene marker that basically is a switch for run timing. And what I mean by run timing is when they return to the river to spawn. So as I said, winter steelhead return sometime through anywhere through most of them March through May and June, and then summer steelhead will return anytime from June to August. So we did a bunch of analysis on adult returning steelhead, about 196 of them in the years 28 and 29. And what we found, you can see on the x-axis, we have the GREB1L marker, summer genotype. What we found is that the summer steelhead really were segregated and had this marker, and that the winter steelhead primarily did. Now, there's a little bit of overlap here, particularly in June and August, but the bottom line is that there's this segregation and there's this marker that basically shows this summer genotype. So when we look a little closer at this data and look at the frequency of this quote unquote summer genotype, let's start with the graph on the left. So when you look at the run timing genotypes of all the fish that we sampled, including juvenile, steelhead, smolt, and adults, and that's over 2,500, you can see that the summer fish have that summer homozygote, and then they have some others, and the winter fish have another they have the winter homozygote. And then if we look at actually the right graft, so we have a pre and a post. The pre is up above and the post is below. And then we have AD above the dams, ID in between. Don't worry about the SBLR, and then below the dams. What we see is that above the dams, pre-dam removal, so the AD in the upper left here, we see that Greb1L marker, but we don't see it in the below dam samples. But now you start seeing it in the below dam samples and also in the in-between dam samples. So the point here being is that we had a downstream movement of these fish, and most of these fish were coming from the resident population, and they became anadromous. So that's the reawakening of the summer steelhead. And I believe Desiree sent you guys a link to with a video about that. So now bull trout, if you remember from my schematic, bull trout now can go from the upstream section all the way out. And this is what bull trout looked like in the upper basin on the upper left before dam removal. They were skinny creatures. They kind of almost look snake-like. And this is what a typical bull trout now looks like after dam removal. And you can see when we actually look at its gut content, it's just filled with stuff from the marine environment. So what's happening here is that these fish are migrating downstream because there's so many more nutrients in the marine environment, and they're actually fattening up in there, and then they're coming back upstream. So again, that reconnection of the river upstream, downstream goes both ways. It's not just it's not just flowing one way. When we look at some of the other species like adult coho salmon, this is showing you relocation sites in the map on the left, and we relocated quite a few of them, as you could see here. And we did that for several years. So basically what we would do is relocate these fish into the Clearwater tributaries. Sorry, I'm going back now, but the Little River coming in here on the river right, and then Indian Creek coming in at river left. And they're within a kilometer of each other where they come in, and that's going to be important in a minute. But what we did is we actually tagged these fish with a visual kind of, it's called a Floyd tag. It looks like a piece of spaghetti, like a bright piece of spaghetti. And then when we went out and did a recite of those tags, what we found was that from 2011 to 2015, we basically saw most of the fish had like over 90% of these fish had tags. But in 2016, everything changed. In other words, we didn't see many of the adults with tags. As a matter of fact, most of them didn't. Since then, and we didn't move any more fish. So the bottom line is that relocation of adult fish actually allowed these fish to spawn in these creeks, these Clearwater creeks of Indian Creek and Little River, and allowed for a recolonization event that now has naturally occurring fish returning to those areas. Another thing that's really interesting about what happened when we did that was that we have two watersheds that have very distinct features. So the Little River coming in on river right is a very cold, a very steep stream. And Indian Creek coming in at river left is a very low gradient wetlet dominated stream that's quite a bit warmer. So we have basically kind of a controlled experiment here that nature gave us. And like I said, Indian Creek is low gradient, wetland dominated. You can see some of the other species such as kokanee salmon and coastal cutthroat trout here. Indian Creek Little River is very cold, and this is where we saw that steelhead in 2013. So when we look at the temperature regime of both of these creeks, what we find is that if you look at between 9 degrees and 19, that's kind of the prime area for salmon to grow and prosper. So not only to eat things, but to metabolize those things. There's a 2-month gross advantage between Indian Creek relative to Little River. So things start to grow sooner in Indian Creek, and conversely, things come out of the gravel sooner too. So the emergence time is earlier as well. So they have a distinct advantage. And what does that mean for the fish? Well, what it means is that there's a difference in life history strategies in those creeks. So even though genetically these are the same fish in each of the creeks, when we look at the data, when we look at the coho fry per spawner per each of the creeks and the coho smolts. So smolts are ones that are going out, fry are ones that are still kind of in the fresh water. They're much smaller, and then the smolts are about twice the size. We see that in Indian Creek, we get both fry and smolts. So in other words, fish stick around Indian Creek because it's a good environment to grow, whereas fish basically come out as fry in Little River. They come out later and they get the heck out of Dodge because it's just a cold place and they want to go somewhere else to perhaps rear for a while. So that happened in the first generation of fish that we actually moved to these different creeks. So in other words, even though they were genetically the same, we saw this difference in life history strategy, which is different than what we saw with steelhead, which that life history strategy difference was a function of the genetics. So again, it's just showing you how opportunistic salmon are in general and what they can do. So overall, when we look at the number of spawning nests above the former dams from 2011 to 2019, you can see we went basically from 0 all the way to about 1,800 spawning nests for a combination of Chinook, steelhead, and coho. And we're also seeing other species. We call them new, but they're really old new. In other words, they were there historically, and now they're making a comeback. So lamprey, which is either something that you're really excited about because you're like, cool, that looks almost alien, or you're like very not excited about because it looks almost alien. So lamprey, which are also a real important for marine-derived nutrients, have increased 12-fold following 3 years after dam removal. We're also seeing sockeye, but based on the genetics, we're not seeing sockeye coming from Lake Sutherland, and sockeye typically need a lake, although there's river type. We're seeing most of these fish are strays, actually from Alaska and British Columbia. I can't give you a reason why, but those are the fish that we're seeing are actually straying all the way from BC and Alaska and heading into the Elwha. So they may be the new colonizers, who knows? So now I'm going to shift gears. I think I've been going about 38 minutes here. So I'm going to shift gears and talk a little bit about the benthic food web. So basically how, and this is work that's been led up by Sarah Morley and Jeff Duda from NOAA and the USGS. So basically how physical habitat changes on the bottom left here and how that affects primary production in terms of algae growth, secondary production in terms of aquatic insects, and what does that mean for the fish that actually reside in the river. And Sarah and Jeff set up a really eloquent study design that they had pre-removal data, during removal, and post-dam removal data below the dams, between the dams, and above the dams. And they also had different habitat types, such as the main river, side channels, and the tributaries. And I'm just going to show you a glimpse of some of this work and really the area between the dams and below the dams. So before dam removal, this is what the Elwha looked like below the Elwha River Dam, which was the lowest one. You could see the density was somewhere around 3,000 individuals per square meter, and it comprised mayflies, stoneflies, and caddisflies, and then also beetles and flies in general. During dam removal, though, because of the sedimentation, there was a dramatic reduction, like a 95% reduction in benthic inverts, but we've seen a pretty dramatic increase since then, and the numbers right around 3,000 again individuals. So really interesting how we just saw almost like a decimation of the invert population, aquatic invert, and then a rebound that quickly. Now in tributaries, we saw something as a control that was really interesting. We've actually seen an overall decline in tributaries. So I want you guys to think about that because that's a question I'm going to ask at the end of this. Why in a tributary that had no impact from sediment would we see a decrease in invertebrates during with dam removal? So I want you to kind of think about that as we move forward. I'm going to talk a little bit about what this means to the fish that are actually trying to eat and grow there. So I really want you to focus on the upper graph here, and we have time on the x-axis and the proportional dry weight of the diet that is aquatic and non-aquatic. Let's just keep it simple for now. And I want you to focus on the upper one, and you can see that historically the aquatics really dominated the diet of omicus or steelhead / rainbow trout. But you could see in 2013 when we really started to see the sedimentation, all of a sudden there was a flip in the diet that went to terrestrial because there was such a decrease in the number of aquatic insects. But you could see as the aquatic insects increased, that is a preferred diet option for steelhead and rainbow trout, and we started to see that change. Whereas if you look at the bottom, so that was in below the dams in the upper part, if you look at the bottom right-hand side, that the tributaries really didn't change. In other words, even though we've seen a decrease in the density of inverts, we've still seen the same proportion in the diets of fish that are residing there. I think one of the most interesting stories in terms of ecosystem response is this one, and this is work that was done by Chris Tonra, Ohio State University and Smithsonian Institute, looking at the linkage between the body condition of American dippers in relation to marine-derived nutrients. And so salmon come back, spawn, and die in these rivers, and they have a lot of nutrients associated with them that are basically derived from the marine environment, of where they basically gain 95% of their weight. And so Chris Tonner has set up a field study where he looked at the yellow areas, which were in the anadromous zone, and the red areas, which were in the non-anadromous zone, or the resident zone. And he looked at the marine-derived nutrients. And what he found was, because dippers like to eat eggs and like to eat insects that are positively impacted by salmon carcasses, we saw that areas with salmon had a different signature of nitrogen and carbon that were more marine derived than those without salmon. So what does that mean when you actually create, or you reconnect an area and you reawaken it with anadromy? Well, what happened was, the anadromous areas actually had female dippers that were larger. The males really didn't change size, but the females actually did change size. And not only that, what he found was that there was higher survival for these dippers in the areas below obstructions, but there was also a 13 times greater likelihood that they would stay resident dippers. In other words, they wouldn't migrate. Whereas before, in the non-anadromous areas, that they would migrate to the anadromous areas. Once an area became anadromous, they didn't have a reason to go anywhere. And as a result, they became 20 times more likely to have multiple brood years. So instead of having one, they would have two offspring in it, basically two hatches in a year. So again, an immediate impact from marine-derived nutrients. So to sum everything up so far, and again, I'm just concluding now, the dams have basically, the dam removal is complete, and that about over half of the sediment stored has been released to the river. In terms of the habitat changes, most of it went downstream into the Strait of Juan de Fuca, creating a delta at the river mouth. A little over 10% stored in the river, and how that's stored is basically in the main channel as the bed built up, with gravel bars and wood accumulating and sediment accumulating behind the wood, but also in the floodplain channels, as now what we're seeing also on the floodplain surface. In terms of the fish recolonization, we've definitely seen adults make it above the dam, and now we've seen over 1,400 spawning nests above the former sites. We're seeing quote unquote new species, which are old species, changes to growth benefits for bull trout, and then really one of the highlights, in my opinion, is the reawakening of summer steelhead, and it's likely due to the harboring of those genetics in the upriver resident population. We're seeing benthic inverts that change dramatically during the dam removal, seeing a comeback and a shift in the diet of salmon, and American dippers altering their migratory behavior and having reproductive benefits for salmon as well. And the one last thing I want to point out to you is that when you look at a kind of a space-time conceptual graph, where you look at the scale of things on the x-axis and how long it takes on the y, you can kind of look at all the different metrics that we look at from an ecosystem perspective and say, okay, how long is it going to take to actually change turbidity versus vegetation or salmon populations? This is what may naturally happen, but this is what the public wants. They want to see kind of everything happen at the watershed scale within basically years. And the reality is, it's going to take decades for some of this stuff to kind of pan out. So that's just something to keep in mind. And while what I showed you is really cool, there's going to be a lot more that happens in the upcoming years to decades. So with that, I just want to thank everyone for listening to me today. And also, there's a bunch of publications we could talk about later, but thank you.
Amazing. Thank you so much. If folks will unmute yourselves and clap, it would be awesome, or you can give the virtual clap. But we're really grateful. Thank you, George. And as an indication of the interest, there are a ton of questions.
Okay. I can't answer that week 5 quiz due date question. I'll leave that one to you.
You weren't supposed to see that.
Okay.
Okay, so maybe we'll just go through those one by one.
Yeah.
So we're curious, were there pink salmon decline and the Chinook increase? This was early in the slide deck.
Yeah, no, it's a really good question, and I think I hinted a little bit at that, but I didn't really give you guys an explanation. So I'm glad you asked that question. So the Chinook population before dam removal was about 2,000 fish. The pink salmon population before dam removal is somewhere around 50 to 100. And I think that that's really an important reason why we're not seeing pink salmon response, to the point now where the tribe and the state are thinking about actually going to the Dungeness River, which is nearby, and they've done genetic analysis to show that they're very similar to the Elwha fish, and actually trying to use them as a way to kind of kickstart the pink salmon population. I think when you're starting with 100 fish and you have as impact as large as the Elwha, we will see what happens if we actually see an increase. It's tough to say. And again, thinking of the theme that you were talking about before about the Klamath. So how does this relate to the Klamath? Well, the Klamath, there's good news about the Klamath, and that is the population sizes for the Klamath in terms of Chinook and Steelhead is much larger than where the Elwha started. So we're talking about like tens of thousands of fish there. So that has a really, that initial starting point really is a big difference. I think also the other thing is life history. Pink salmon don't spend much time in fresh water, but where they've spent time in fresh water is in the gravels, late summer, early fall, in the main stem rivers, and that's what got beaten up the most in terms of the sedimentation. So I think there's a couple reasons.
Okay, thank you. I was also curious why at the Elwha Dam there was so much of that material left in place. I think I know the answer, but I was wondering if you could comment on that.
I don't actually know the answer to that. I do know that where they have the river now is the natural, there was a canyon there. So most of that, like that hump that you see there is actually bedrock. So it's not like there was like an overburden that was put on there and then the dam was put on there. But where the dam site was in that kind of canyon reach, there was some real issues down there where it actually failed once in 1913, and then they just stuffed it with whatever they could, and then they rebuilt it up again. And that's one thing to think about with dam removal, is how well were these dams originally built, especially, and most of them are going to be older dams that you're taking out. So you find some unforeseen things when you start looking at those areas.
Indeed. Okay, thanks. Next question is from Sierra. Why wasn't the sediment release as consistent when the stored sediment in Elwha Reservoir was exposed as when the mill sediment was exposed?
So the inconsistency in sediment release had to do with other factors downstream. So the Aldwell, most of it was fine sediment, so they didn't really have an issue. Once that was let go, it didn't really have that much of an impact on the river itself, like in terms of the morphology. There was a transient effect in terms of the finer sediment. Actually, the biggest effect from Aldwell that I didn't talk about was organics. That's one thing nobody really estimated, and that's something, again, if you're thinking of the Klamath, ask the question, how much of it is organics, and what will that mean to the water quality? Because what happened in the Elwha is we've got these pulses of really reduced dissolved oxygen. Everybody's like, what the heck's happening? And really what it was basically organic material that never decayed. Now, the reason that Mills was kind of so inconsistent actually was because there
Uh-oh.
decided to put a surface water facility for industrial purposes for the city of Port Angeles. It didn't work out that well, and so they went to rainy wells eventually. And I will say this: I'm going to point out somebody and give them a kudos on this. Tim Randall, who retired from the Bureau of Reclamation, pointed out two things on the Elwha. He said, one, you have to watch out for rockfall in the Glines Canyon area, because when they put that arch dam in, that was one of the first arch dams that they ever put in. And so, when you have an arch dam in a place for 100 years, you don't really know what's going to happen to the rock face once you actually release that, that abutment. And, he didn't predict it, but he said that's something you need to look out for. He also said it's probably not a good idea to put in a surface withdrawal facility below a dam removal. You may want to use rainy wells. He was right on both occasions. Nobody listened to him, but it was just one of those things where, again, when you're thinking of the Klamath, when you're thinking of options of dam removal, and I think you might actually, I don't know if you touch on this with your paper with Matt, Desiree, but it's like any other design process. you really want to keep an open mind early on, because as you get further and further downstream in terms of that design process, there's much more cost involved to change anything. And that is just a really big component. So getting back to the sediment question, they cut off the dam removal for a while because the river was responding to the sediment, and then they kind of opened it up again for it to happen. So that was part of the reason why there was inconsistency.
Thank you. Can you tell us what the estuary looks like now?
Yeah, you can go on Google Earth and look at it too. It looks very similar to what I showed you. In other words, that barrier beach is there. The blind tidal channels are there. There's some more. There's quite a bit more vegetation underwater now than there was back then. I didn't show you any photos of that, but we're actually getting like, kelp beds and other things. It's really cool. But it really looks very similar to what you see what I showed you.
And I know this probably isn't, offshore coastal erosion is probably not your primary area of expertise, but do you expect it to stay like that? Or is this going to be permanent, or will some of that material erode over time?
I think the stuff that really was going to erode, it did. Now, if there's some kind of major event, who knows what's going to happen? But in terms of the dam removal, I think we're done in terms of that being really dynamic anymore due to the dam removal.
Okay, thanks. Have the pools scoured out since the dam removal? Has anybody even?
Yes. Yeah. So the pools have come back really remarkably well, and a lot of them in the same place too, which I was really surprised at. I mean, when you think of a gravel bed river, you think of it being really dynamic, but the reality is that there's a reason for kind of scour in specific areas, and those reasons haven't changed that much, just the amount of sediment change. So yeah, they actually have come back quite well.
Okay, thank you. Is this sonar counting the future to replace catch trap counting?
So the sonar, we're going to continue using the sonar for adult returns. So remember the sonar is used for fish coming back, big fish coming back. The catching is for little fish going out the river. So we're going to keep doing that as well. So both of those will be used. I think where the sonar has really come, it has replaced the spawning surveys as an adult enumeration method. But the spawning surveys are really useful to see the distribution of fish, of where they actually were.
Excellent, thank you. What are the hatchery to wild proportions in the system?
So the hatchery to wild proportions are for Chinook salmon, the vast majority are still hatchery fish. So even though we're seeing an increase in the numbers, the adult returns are still hatchery, and I think that's going to change over time. So I would say like 90% plus for Chinook. For steelhead, it's maybe a third. Most of them are actually natural. For the summer steelhead, it's 100% natural. For the coho, it's a mix because basically we relocated them. So I would say maybe most of them are still hatchery, like 2/3, but a third of them are wild, or not wild, but naturally spawning. So yeah.
Okay, thanks. Next one is about the jump in 2019. I don't remember if that was for steelhead, where we didn't really see
that was for Chinook salmon. So I think the 2019 jump is, so the way you have to think about this is that, so if we're catching smolts coming out in 2019, that means they were put in the gravels in 2018. And that means the adults that actually spawned in 2018, you have to look at the average age of those. So when were those fish actually born and moved out of the system? So that's about 2016 or 2015, 2016. So that means basically when that pulse of sediment was gone, that's when we started to see a gain. So yeah, when you're doing the math on salmon, it's a little tricky because you have to kind of go back in terms of the age structure, at least for certain species.
There's a couple of questions about the rock fall. First, how you knew it was a passage barrier, and then how you decided how much blasting to do, like how much of the channel to open. And
it's a good question. So we actually measured it. Andy, I don't know. I know that Desiree knows Andy Ritchie, who is we consider probably he is the guru behind a lot of the stuff that we, in terms of the sediment work. I mean, it's just phenomenal what he did there with structure from motion. Anyway, but Andy's the one who went out and measured it, and we knew it was a passage barrier because we measured it, and we also basically saw fish ganging up at the bottom and didn't see any fish above. And the way we blasted it was basically we wanted to make sure that that there was essentially nothing left of those rocks, and that way we knew that there was a safety kind of factor that fish could get past it. So that yeah, so it wasn't like we those guys basically were trying to obliterate the rocks, and that's beyond my technical knowledge of blowing up rocks. But we basically got the Navy Seabees in to do the job, I think. So anyway.
Okay, excellent, thanks. I was curious. It looked like there was a picture of a fish vomiting. How
Yep.
do you? I thought that you got contents by cutting the fish open, but it sounds like there's
No,
some.
you can actually. It's called gastric lavage. It's a waterboarding technique ostensibly, where you basically take a funnel, you blast water in its gut, and then it just starts puking out whatever's in there. It's not exactly a luxurious, or it's not a pretty way to go, but it's very effective. Put it that way.
And it is non-lethal, presumably.
It's non-lethal. It's exactly right.
Great. Okay. Will wanted to know about the big drop in invertebrates during dam removal. Was that expected, or did people get concerned?
I don't think it was. I don't think the drop was unexpected. Was unexpected. I do think the recovery, how quickly it happened, because you ask yourself, where did they come from? Like, in other words, was there a change in the productivity of the animals that survived, or were they actually immigrating from the tributaries into these areas? Yeah, it's a tough one to understand, and I would defer to Sarah Morley and Jeff, but it was really unexpected to see how quickly it came back. I don't think that the reduction was unexpected, but I think the response was.
Yeah, it was interesting too that a lot of them were dipteras, so there's a lot of flies that recolonized.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, Sierra asked, did you also directly study the impacts of sedimentation on fish spawning?
That's a really good question, and we didn't put in scour chains or egg to fry survival boxes. We did look at fine sediment though, and I can send you guys, I can give Desiree some papers to pass around, where we looked at what proportion of the gravels that these fish were spawning in was fine sediment. And we definitely saw an increase, but what was really interesting is most of the fine sediment was caught in the floodplain channels themselves. So in other words, one of the hypotheses we had is that the floodplain channels would be sediment storage areas, and it actually was almost selective sediment storage, really. So it wasn't in the riffle crest themselves. I mean, the riffle crest definitely got a lot of sediment, but not nearly as much as the floodplain channels that were inundated with it. And so the floodplain became an attenuator for the effects of the fine sediment for fish spawning. And what we saw was basically an increase in the amount of gravels more than an increase in the amount of fines.
Okay, we had another question about the delta, but I think you've already answered that.
Okay.
Dan asked about salmon returning to the exact same spot where they spawn. How does this jive with the return of anadromous fish to upstream reaches of former dam sites?
It's a really good question. So one of the things that there's a bunch of tenets of homing and straying as a function of species, as a function of wild hatchery. So a couple things that we've learned is that coho salmon are really very precise spawners. In other words, they really focus on where they actually came from, to the point of where it's not only the tributary, but the reach of the tributary in many cases. Chinook salmon seem to be a lot more pervasive to actually stray at different places, but it's confounded with the fact that so many of the fish are hatchery fish. And that might be a big part of it. It's also more confounded because males tend to stray more than females, and so yeah, well, not a surprise. But anyway, yeah. So it was really interesting how that affected it. Now for the steelhead, which is really interesting, is the summer steelhead and the winter steelhead. We are seeing that segregation by river location. And if you look at the resident rainbow population where the summer steelhead came from, they're in the upper part of the basin. And that makes sense in terms of the fact that that's where the genetic marker is. And also that's where there's a lot of evolutionary ecology that's associated with this. But basically, when things are colder, fish take longer to grow. And that typically happens in the upper portion of basins, and that typically happens to fish that are earlier in the migration pattern. So evolutionarily speaking, you come in the river earlier to get further upstream further. Does that make sense? And that's kind of what happens. So yeah, we've seen a variety of different things with the different species in terms of that homing and straying. And it does jive, but it also doesn't too. So it's kind of classic biology where it's really quite messy and it's not as clean as geomorphology, that's for sure.
I love that you think geomorphology is clean.
Relative to this biology is pretty clean, yeah.
Fair enough. You do know that Einstein told his son not to study sediment transport though, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I'm gonna say that sediment transport is a whole different thing, just talking about landforms, right? So anyway.
Okay, we're a little over time, but you have just a couple more questions if you're willing to stick around.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, thanks. We did have someone asking about revegetation. Maybe you can just quickly comment on what's done and what y'all are doing.
Yes. So the same guy, just so everybody knows, who did the work on the Elwha is doing the work on the Klamath. So Josh Chenoweth is a great resource for you guys if you're really interested in this question. And he actually took a job with one of the tribes, I think the Yurok tribe, down in the Klamath area, and he's working on it because he worked on the revegetation in the Elwha. And so the reveg in the Elwha was a combination of natural revegetation and also prescribed revegetation, where they took seeds actually from the former reservoir before they drained it and actually, got a greenhouse and grew things that were from the reservoir. And then they tried to do revegetation in combination with natural revegetation. And what they basically found was that in the finer sediments, where you actually were able to retain water, you got really rapid revegetation. In the coarser sediments, none of the kind of the revegetation that they tried really worked, and only natural revegetation worked there. So in short, the finer sediments definitely help with the revegetation process of the planting as opposed to the natural revegetation of the coarser areas.
Yeah, that's a good point and interesting given how much fine material there is at the Klamath. Like whatever sediment is left after the drawdown is probably likely to revegetate. Although we had a couple of our students in our program, the ECO-E program, who worked with River Design Group to study revegetation on Klamath soils. And because there's so much silt and clay, the contraction with drying was so severe, and there's some questions about what types of vegetation will be able to thrive there.
Yeah.
Last question about other dam removals that you've worked on.
I haven't had the opportunity really to work on other dam removals like your illustrious professor here has, and she's worked on a number of them, which is great actually. But I have helped out with the Klamath. It's been really a pleasure to work with people up down there, and trying to help them out with their reintroduction plan, and just kind of as a sounding board to help them out. They have they have similar challenges and different challenges than we did. But they're really trying to use us as a guide to help them with certain things. And so that's the only other one that I've really even had an inkling of working on. I'd love to work on more, but yeah, so far just the Elwha.
Great. Thank you so much. Any final questions from people in Zoom land? All right, George, thank you again so much. So grateful.
Oh, yeah. And if anybody wants to contact me, just send me an email. Desiree's got my contact information. And do you want me to put some, send you a couple of, I think you actually got the papers, didn't you, already, that I sent? But if anybody has any specific questions, just contact me. Be happy to talk anytime.
Thanks again, George. Appreciate it.
Yeah. Thank you guys. Have a good